Welcome, everyone, to the next AI Collective Lightning Talk. We have today Dr. Katherine or Kate Eisenberg with us. She's a physician, clinical informaticist, and someone who's been working right at the intersection of healthcare and AI for years. She's currently the senior medical director for Dyna AI, where she's leading how AI actually gets used in real clinical decision making, not just in theory, but in practice. She's not just coming from the tech side, she's also been a founding partner of a family medicine practice and has spent over a decade working directly with patients. So she really understands both sides of the problem. And with that, Kate, over to you.
Thank you. I thought I have a deck, but I think maybe I'll just use that as prompts and just kind of talk. And if folks want to jump in, that's fine. I feel like in this day and age, everything turns into a Q&A because it's changing so quickly. So thank you for that introduction. I am a practicing family physician. I still do practice with about 20% of my time. And I was fortunate to be at Dynamed, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's an evidence-based point of care resource. So traditionally competes with UpToDate and now competes with open evidence as well. So point of care clinical resource. And I was working there on advanced decision support tools when ChatGPT came out. So I had the opportunity to be involved from the beginning at applying generative AI to this body of content. So Dyna AI is what our tool is called. So it's an AI tool to provide evidence-based clinical information at the point of care. And it was really wild to be there when that all first started because there was no, there were no evaluation methods. There was not really a framework. There were no standards. And there was a lot of pressure to apply AI in practice. And so we were just talking about if you're someone like me who likes to figure things out and get my hands on things, it was a really fun opportunity. So I wrote a policy to help bring people together to get us started because folks were very concerned about applying AI in practice, but we knew we had to do something. I helped stand up a governance board, which I still chair and run, just to get some outside advice on how to apply generative AI in practice. And I designed our evaluation methods for our tool. Through that work, I ended up working with the Coalition for Health AI on their clinical decision support working group, and currently on their agentic working group, which has been a really good experience for me because there was so much just finding our way. It was really nice to compare notes with other people who were trying to apply, the same concepts in practice, and we were bumping up and continue to bump up against a lot of parallel challenges. So it's been just professionally a very interesting time. I think the key message right now uh, in governance, which is coming from a vendor perspective and a physician perspective, and starting to learn the regulatory landscape myself, is that the technology and tools and adoption are quite far out ahead of governance and evaluation infrastructures. And I think the average person using AI-based tools might not recognize that there may not have been any standard or rule applied to an AI tool before it found its way to your hands. So just to give a really high level overview of the regulatory uh, landscape right now, there's FDA, which can regulate software as a medical device, and they put out new guidance as of January, offering some clarification about what they do intend or do not intend to enforce regulation as a medical device. So there was a big gray area there. And as the technology has advanced, more gray area opens up. So they made it a bit clearer where some of those lines were. And in general, they're taking a more um, hands-off approach. Um, They and at the same time, they're trying to create and speed pathways for those software areas that are considered a medical device. And then there's a lot going on at the state level. It's creating kind of a crazy patchwork of different regulations, largely aimed at reducing bias related to using algorithms or targeting disclosure to patients or targeting chatbots that are functioning as though they were a licensed professional. So a lot of laws focused on behavioral health in particular, but also broader healthcare advice. Colorado already has a law that is in on the books. California has some and more coming out. Texas, Illinois, and New York. So this was very prominent in the news in the fall about the federal government considering putting out um, a ban on states regulating AI laws. That didn't happen. So now there is kind of this patchwork, and it's pretty difficult um, to keep up with. And a lot of it is kind of almost experimental with okay, what does it mean that you have to disclose AI use to a patient? They're not usually privy to like all the details of my workflow. Do they even want to know some of those details? So a lot of questions coming out, but the states are the ones pushing that forward. And then the EU AI Act is the other more robustly developed piece of regulation in this area. So for global companies, they have to navigate that as well, which has more stringent standards. Then there's standards bodies or bodies putting out best practices. So the Coalition for Health AI, which I mentioned, is not a standards body, but they're putting out best practices for different use cases and different risk levels about transparency, about putting out like a model card, for example. They have a template you can fill out for your tool that a health system might use and say, okay, here's the metrics this company has used to assess this tool. They can review those. There's standards bodies like HL7 who, so you have fire standards, but they're not necessarily fully adapted for what we need for AI and particularly AI agents. So there's a lot of work there to make those standards more fully specified for an AI-based world. And it's the same for the technical standards, right? So when we're looking at these standards coming out for agents to talk to other agents, they're largely not designed for healthcare. So they may not have enough specificity around like data privacy and security for a healthcare use case. So there's this kind of area where there's not sufficient standard specification for all the technology to apply to healthcare, if that um, makes sense. And then there's new um, the the Office of the National Coordinator. You may see this and then use HTI 5 has not been formally finalized yet, but it is coming and in is considered generally to be a rollback of some of the prior more detailed interoperability standards, so more of a deregulatory approach as the industry's receiving it. So there's kind of that regulation level, standards bodies level, and then there's the like science level. How do we evaluate AI-based tools? In the first couple years after ChatGPT came out, a lot of that was um, based around healthcare licensing exams because they're quantitative. You can compare them directly to each other. They're not the most relevant in practice, but they're kind of splashy. So there were a couple years where that was most of what was coming out, and now those methods are getting more mature. So we're seeing more real world scenarios come out in practice. We're seeing more prospective evaluations, and um, I think that the bar is raising for um, assessing these systems in more real world conditions. At the same time, there still is not any, one benchmark or any one standard that like a tool like mine has to meet. So I can be providing clinical reference information that is getting used as folks are seeing patients and our team is diligently assessing our tool, but that's based on our own internal standards. So and every team who's building such a tool is having to develop and design their own evaluation. Um, so I still feel like it's really the Wild West there, and there's a lot of different ways that one might evaluate these types of tools. So accuracy, concordance with guidelines, completeness, usability, workflow integration, um, risk of harm, and then risk of drift over time. These systems are very dynamic between the model piece, the medical literature, and evolving workflows. Um, so there's been this growing realization that monitoring these systems over time is critical, but that's a new requirement essentially. So most health systems and vendors are not necessarily set up. Like my team did not previously have a need to have a robust ongoing monitoring program beyond our typical editorial policies. But when we add in this generative AI layer, now we do. So I think another theme that I see um, emerging and that has been a real challenge is okay, a governance assessment takes real resourcing and a AI evaluation and AI monitoring takes real resourcing. In a lot of companies and health systems, that was not happening before. Who's paying for that? And, who's um, where are those resources coming from? So what's happening is there's this kind of growing divide between better resourced systems who have set up this infrastructure, who are doing these evaluations, who might have a data scientist, who have clinicians who can take some of their time to evaluate tools, and everybody else. So there's this emerging maturity spectrum for AI governance where users and health systems fill in the gap where they can, but a lot of folks may not be as well positioned um, to do so. So I think especially when we're looking at an AI agent, so an AI that's taking an action, we're just starting to get the frameworks, methods, benchmarks for generative AI to begin with, let alone agents that might be talking to each other and these more complex systems. What does transparency look like? What does performance look like from that perspective? So it's quite a moment because so much is emerging at once, and any kind of framework or evaluation or regulation is just trying to keep up. So I can stop there so we have enough time for Q&A, but that's my take on things.
Thank you very much, Kate.
How do you raise your hand here? I'm raising my hand. Um, so the one you said a bunch of things, and it seems to me that there's a bunch of very different use cases that kind of got felt like they got glommed into one. So I want to pick at one of them. You use the term software as a medical device, which is one I'm very familiar with. But to me, that's always been very specific to like analytics that took data and produced, So essentially, it's a real device somewhere. The software as a medical device is a virtual device on top of that that say takes EKG data, for example, and produces. I've seen something that said a sepsis advisory. That would be software as a medical device, but not the rest. So I'm confused as to whether you're meaning everything you talked about with software as a medical device or only that use case.
So that it's such a good question, and I think that's been the challenge with so many new tools, especially with generative AI, is there has been a lot of confusion. I think that definition, as you're explaining it, was pretty cut and dry. And in my world, so when we're talking about clinical decision support, the line as I understood it was if you're taking individual patient data from the EHR and applying some processing to that, that was considered a medical device or could be.
So any clinical decision support software is considered to be software as a medical device.
Mm-mm. But
Because
patient,
go ahead.
No, I mean not being not being an attorney, I have been learning this space, but as I so I used to work on pre-Gen AI. I worked on a tool where we would automatically take patient data, specific fields from the medical record, bump them up against a bespoke algorithm that my team designed, and then we would make a recommendation for that patient's care. So pre-Gen AI, that was
But yeah,
leading
and that was
edge.
deemed soft. So for example,
It was on the border. Like
But
that
that's
was,
because, can I just add, that's because you're
yeah,
making a recommendation, though. So, like, that's the key, in my understanding, that's the key differentiator. If you were to just like, so that up to date, for example, like they just have reference documents of like standard of care, and so that's not a software as a medical device. It's not even a clinical decision support system because there's no recommendation or like there's no algorithm that takes in data and alters it in a certain way. So just wanted to clarify.
so I'll give you an
um,
example of something that I'd be curious to take your take on whether this software. So even with no AI involved, I mean, there is the CDS framework where you can plug in, you know, decision support tools into the workflow. It's an HL7 standard. And one of the things that you can do is, and what I saw was a lot of these calculators in a particular workflow, they would pull records so that they could say, okay, for this patient, the recommended dose of this drug is
right.
37 milliliters.
As Albert was
That would
saying,
pop
right?
up as
There's
a
that
prompt.
recommendation.
And,
Yeah.
and so it's not making a decision, but it's saying, here's my calculation.
I don't
And it
even think
wasn't
that that
considered,
would qualify, in my
it wasn't
understanding.
considered as that, but it kind of falls in some of the things you described. So that's why I'm confused.
Right. It, as I understand it, right, you start to get into really splitting hairs. So, for example, in the EU, the advice that we got, we have this suite of 600 calculators
Hmm.
that you can enter patient data and get a recommendation. The advice we got was that the more complex ones would qualify as a medical device. So it's like,
That sounds very gray.
right it felt very gray, and maybe maybe it is more cut and dry than I'm understanding it. So in January, and you can look this up, the FDA issued additional guidance because there were so many emerging gray areas. And I know in my CDS world, for example, so Albert, you used the example of up to date, which is structured very similarly to the product I work on. So these big blocks of reference text, right? Nobody thinks that's a medical device and it's barely considered decision support. So now when you put an AI layer on top of that, so you can question and answer the the body of content, I
Mhm.
can make that pretty patient specific, and I can get a very specific recommendation or paragraph, specific to the clinical scenario I've put in. So now let's say I'm scraping a medical record for patient information that I then put into my AI system and get a specific output, but it's coming from that same body of content. That feels like a very gray area. So the FDA put out some clarification to help everybody understand that in that situation, they would not enforce that as a medical device. That is not what they would consider software as a medical device. But in some other situations, so mostly like the EKG example, still clearly a yes. In the case of like more emergent examples, very time sensitive examples, where they may be issuing a very specific recommendation that may still fall on that device side of the line. So I think the understanding had to shift and their interpretation had to shift as the gray area opened up more. So you're asking great questions because it genuinely did change.
What other great questions or comments? Dan, Robert, Chris, anyone else?
So that
Yeah,
means
uh,
all AI agents
yeah.
are medical devices, pretty much, if they're touching patient care. from what you're saying, for the most part.
I
Because it's
mean,
that black box where it's making a decision you don't know why.
I don't
yeah,
think
I mean, I
I
can't,
wouldn't say
it
that.
seems like it really depends what it's doing. And when you say touching patient care, is that scheduling? That feels administrative, but is
Right,
it
right, right,
scheduling
right.
based on
Clinical.
an
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
urgent triage request? That's more clinical. So I cannot claim to be an expert in this area, but I've definitely had to learn both about EU and US lines that are being drawn because it matters so much, because the difference between getting regulated as a medical device and not um is so critical about what data you have to produce and what package of information you had to produce.
But I have a question about you're talking about like model drift, and this was like brought up um like in the discussion group that we have. And so like it's I think it's like it's a good point to like that we need to come up with like frameworks that evaluate model drift, but like in my understanding, like even with generative AI today, there wouldn't be that much drift. So like, let's say you come up with a clinical decision support, and you're using a particular model in the API, and but you fix that model to like Opus 4.6, whatever the time frame it's like trained on. There would be no model drift because like your base LLM is stable. And if you have like a RAG infrastructure and it's not changing, there wouldn't be any model drift. So like I could see how like if you're updating your database that you're pulling from that, or you're allowing it to access like the web search, then there could be model drift. But like, what does this apply to? And like in the future agentic frameworks, where like again, there's like dynamic updating of their modeling framework, based off of like like their historical interactions and stuff. But like it doesn't seem to be relevant currently really. So I guess that's my first question. And then like what are the frameworks that you've seen for evaluating drift over time?
So maybe the term model drift isn't quite correct. I think the idea is that the systems are dynamic. So in the case of like an evidence-based tool, the evidence is always being updated. Our content.
But that's if you allow the model to be retrained on that evidence though.
So we're in the case of the tool I work on and other similar tools, we're not training a model or retraining the model. We're using a RAG system to
Where
access.
RAG systems can drift is because they rely on some curated data model that
Yeah.
feed it, and that can. I think this is what you're getting at here. So you don't have the stored resource that you're using to feed your RAG system. Maybe it's a vector database, for example, has not been kept up with the systems of record externally, and that can cause drift.
Well, there's that. There's so many moving parts in these systems that the end output can drift because there's the underlying model you're using, which I don't think they're purely static even once they're released,
No,
but
they are purely static unless you explicitly retrain them, which you should not be doing
Yeah.
unless you want to cause yourself a huge amount of pain.
but that in any case, at least the experience to date is those are continually like we have to keep replacing the model.
I think the great part about these discussions is that each of us really just has one part of the bigger picture, and it's only really by bringing in the expertise that different people have that we sort of form a better perspective of the bigger one.
Sure. And I guess
We
my
we
perspective is these
yeah.
models are dynamic for whatever reason. It's been hard to speak long enough to explain why I think that, but that's my
Understood,
opinion.
understood. I would love to take a picture. Keith, we can agree to disagree. It's fine. Thank you everyone for joining. Always nice. See you all next time. Bye bye. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Kate.
Kate.
Sure.
Thank
Thank you.
Kate.